Hello, my name is Ostrin Fire, and it has been like 4 weeks since, I think about a month, 3 weeks, something like that, since I recorded my review of the Genesis of Shannara. And then I'm like, all right, I'm going to do an extra video. And then I'm like, am I going to actually do an extra video? And I was 100% not sure. And then I finally decided, all right, yeah, I'm just going to do the extra video because I really like the ideas I had for the extra video. And I ended up somehow wearing a red shirt again. In this case, though, it's a long sleeve red shirt because it's quite chilly this morning. So that's fun. But also, I have my work shirt on underneath, but I don't want to just wear that on a video. So it's just kind of like, all right, I'm just going to throw on a long sleeve shirt because it's kind of comfortably cool this morning anyway. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the Genesis of Shannara, because I obviously implied that I had a couple of ideas of how to change it, because like I mentioned in pretty much every video about the series, I obviously had some very serious issues like the world building and the storytelling and so forth. But the thing is that when I wanted to come up with these ideas, I actually started writing notes down somewhere. Yep, here it is in this notepad here, but I've only written about half of it. But I'm doing the video now because if I don't do it now, then I might never end up doing it. And my big thing is that I wanted to basically what my idea was to keep the basic plot of Genesis intact without, like I wanted to change some of the underlying details and keep the basic, but otherwise keep the basic plot of Genesis intact. And I think it's actually pretty easy. Because all it does really is that you're just kind of moving some pieces around in the story so that the story doesn't, or rather so that the backdrop for the story is more convincing, and because the backdrop is more convincing, the overall story becomes more convincing. And I think the biggest change that I really kind of want to make, and I had wanted to like a few weeks ago, I wanted to flesh this out more and try to do something a little special, but in the grand scheme of things, it's just like, I'm not really gonna, I not have the time or the will to do that. So I'm just gonna give like a basic overview. And my first big thing goes back to what I was talking about all the way back when I reviewed Armageddon's Children. And that is, I'm gonna change like the setup of the world. So basically, Terry Brooks has everyone, in all these little isolated compounds, and no one really works together. Everyone's isolated. Everyone's scared. It's been 30 years. And I immediately want to change that, because if you pay any attention to history whatsoever, the simple fact of the matter is, and I mentioned this before, people band together. People band together for mutual protection, for mutual resource sharing, all that sort of thing. And I think that that's just one of those things that needs to happen. I think that I go back to my harping on Texas, back in my Armageddon's Children video, where it's like, no, there would still be a Texas. It might be its own independent nation. It might be smaller, but there would still be a nation of Texas. Or like if you went over to Europe, there would still be a bunch of Balkan nations over in the Balkans. Okay, the Serbians and the Bosnians. I know the Romanians aren't part of the Balkans. I don't think Romania is considered part of the Balkans, but the same idea. All those little people, all those little and or big people groups over in that region, right? They would still have their own countries because they literally have fought multiple wars for independence, and they fought rebellion. They've rebelled and they've done all these things that have caused them. Excuse me. That have caused them. Have caused them to fight wars for, to be independent nations. They would still exist over there, and you'd have all sorts of little ethnic and cultural enclaves all over the world that would still try to maintain a sense of nation states and cohesion. And that's one of the big things I would change. But because of that change, it would change something else important, which is that Findogask and all the other demons across the world, because we assume there's many demons across the world leading many armies. I think that makes the most sense, right? Because Findogask has been, is committed to this, to the attacking people in the United States for a quarter century now, basically, right? the thing is that there's now going to be some sort of organized resistance against him. It's not just going to be a handful of Knights of the Word who are being ignored by incredibly stupid people who would absolutely know that they are under grave threat, and thus there would be a lot more at stake than just simply trying to maintain their way of life. But there would be an organized resistance, and in order to create this idea of an organized resistance, I'm going to bring a character who's dead in the book back to life. And that would be Logan Tom's mentor, Michael. In the novel, of course, Michael basically went insane, and Logan had to kill him to stop his insanity from hurting more people. Obviously, it's not a bad plot point. It's not bad as a motivation point for Logan Tom, and why he doesn't really want to get too close to people, why he doesn't want to attach to people, why he doesn't want to help people in a more dedicated fashion than he already is. But I don't think that is actually a terribly good I think that no, let me back that up. I think that leaving Michael alive is a good idea because it helps to kind of bring everything together. Because what I'm thinking is basically first of all, Michael would now be a Knight of the Word. He wouldn't just be a random guy. He would actually be a Knight of the Word alongside, in the narrative, Logan Tom and Angel Perez. And basically, you would have three different Knight of the Word perspective characters who are all doing different things. Michael is actually actively taking the fight to demonkind. Logan Tom has, over time, become highly cynical and has struck out on his own. And this also allows him the freedom to travel up to Seattle to find the Gypsy Morph. And then Angel Perez is kind of like the middle ground between them in like an ideological sense. Like, she's actively fighting against demons, but at the same time, she hasn't really moved from the Los Angeles area. And basically, what's going to happen here is that Michael is leading an army in the battle against Findogask, but of course Findogask's army is much more powerful, much larger. Now, granted, there would have to be some other changes. There actually have to be like the Once Men army would need to actually have some real logistical concerns rather than just being a mindless horde of people who don't really need to eat or do much sleeping or don't get tired or all that, because that actually introduces some really serious issues in the narrative as well. Because Findogask's army basically has to be limited by the author rather than being limited by some internal in-universe issue. Simple fact of the matter is the Once Men army is really not the sort of thing that I feel like can be stopped very easily, not just by like obstacles and so forth, but pretty much anything. And the idea that, a small handful of people can actually hold off this army is very improbable. So like obviously new ideas would have to be introduced as to how the Once Men function and how they are affected by things like morale and how they're affected by things like fatigue and how they're affected by things like casualties. Okay, that's tied into morale. And stuff like that, though. You can make them hardier against things like morale shocks and fatigue and whatnot without making them impervious to it, unless the narrative demands they're not impervious to it, basically. And basically going back to it, basically what my idea is that Michael, right, is leading this army, and basically his army's been on a long, steady retreat against Findogask over the years. He's been retreating across the United States. He started fighting him all the way back, I guess, in the Northeast or wherever the Once Men army was started. And despite all of his efforts and despite, victories and defeats, Michael's never had a chance to actually win against the Once Men army. And when we pick up the story, basically, Findogask is already, basically when we pick up the story, we're going to go back a little bit back into the past from where the story actually begins, where Findogask is already in Los Angeles and has already destroyed all the compounds there. And instead we're going to go back where basically these two armies are out like in the desert, just north of the desert in the mountainous regions in like northern New Mexico and Arizona, where Michael's retreating. And bear in mind, Michael's been fighting this for so long that he's basically Napoleon. Okay, he's basically a tactical genius, and because he has, just from pure experience, he knows what he has to do. You know, that's the very basics of it. He knows what he has to do simply from his prior experience. And basically it's, you know, they're withdrawing towards Los Angeles and the demon army is pursuing them. And meanwhile, the events of the book largely are playing out the same. But what's going to end up happening is, rather than like Findo just randomly breaking off part of his army to go up the coast and to attack Seattle, which felt very random, and it's like, where did he get the boats from? How are they doing this precisely? It's not very clear. It's another one of those events that kind of just happens, rather than it happens for a logical reason. But what's going to happen, what's going to start pushing everyone together, is rather than it being Findo Gask's army that attacks like Los Angeles and attacks Seattle, well, obviously there's other demon armies across the world. So what if the demon armies come from elsewhere? What if, say, a demon army comes from overseas, and, you know, it's been following like the coast of like Asia and North America until it comes to the Puget Sound, and it's like an army from like, I don't know, Japan or Korea or something, you know, and they come in and start attacking Seattle. And what if there's another army from like South America, you know, that comes up the Pacific coast and attacks Los Angeles? You know, I think it's very unlikely that either of these armies will be marching on foot, because there's not much in the way of like things to attack, you know, that far north. I mean, obviously, you know, the populations in Alaska and Canada and so forth would be very light, and probably some of these populations would have amalgamated over time as well, as resources became more scarce. But, you know, at the end of the day, there's not going to be a meaningful population for these armies to march over, so they're just going to skip over, you know, the desert. They're going to skip over the empty wilderness. I know it's not totally empty, but like the empty wilderness of, you know, of like northern Canada and Alaska, and just come straight to where there's actually people to enslave and commit experiments on. And that's the kind of beginning, and these three armies kind of converging is going to be kind of like the inciting incident that actually starts forcing everyone together. And the story just kind of keeps going, right? And, you know, and they're like all forced to retreat, and they're all going up the corridor between the coast and Sierra Nevadas and all that stuff. And, you know, and pretty much events can occur roughly the same. Obviously, you have to fix some things, like I was complaining about how Simmerlin and Kirison turned into complete idiots in the ice cave in Mount Rainier, and it's like, no, they're not going to be complete idiots. Something smarter is going to happen. Okay, don't know what it is. Not terribly important. But at the end of the day, everything kind of functions the way it does. And what kind of keeps the elves rooted in place, though, is that they think they're well hidden, right? And even though, you know, Michael's army's coming up the coast, you know, coming up the coast and then up the valley, trying to escape Findo Gask, and now the army that has overrun Los Angeles, and there's refugees, and, you know, massive refugee camps and convoys and everything, and, you know, people are trying to protect each other. Michael's trying to keep them all organized. Michael's army has been pretty badly mauled over the course of this time, but they have been reinforced, you know, by refugees from, like, you know, from the various cities and so forth. And ultimately what ends up happening is that during a rather pitched fight in Oregon, you know, the elves come up with an army and help Michael, and actually manage to throw Findo Gask back, allowing them to retreat in a more coherent fashion. And again, story, narrative continues the way it has. You know, they're all starting to retreat over, you know, they retreat past the Columbia River, and then they retreat through Washington, and then they come up to the final, and then there's the final battle at the dam. And then what ends up happening at the dam, basically, is that, well, the only thing, you know, it's like, I don't know, for whatever reason, like, the Columbia River is, I don't know how you really force this. This is one of those things where I think plot contrivance is going to be a little bit required, because it kind of had to be required in the original book as it was. But basically, what ends up happening is that, you know, they reach that dam, whichever dam it is. I know there's a couple along the Columbia's North Branch, because I looked it up on Google Maps. I thought I was just curious, you know, like, where do these things occur? And I kind of figured out roughly where the events of the story occur. And basically what's going to happen is that Michael's going to decide that, well, he has to save You know, he has to save human civilization, and it's like a man like him, you know, and maybe it's like the somewhat cliched idea that a man like him, a man who's basically built and bred for war at this point, doesn't think there's a place for him in this, you know, in the world that's to come, you know, in a hope for peace. And so what he does is that he takes basically an army of volunteers, you know, maybe 1,000 or so people, and he holds this choke point against, you know, 3 converging armies of enemies, and while the Gypsy Morph, Hawk, and all these thousands of people, because now it's thousands of people, it's not just a bunch of children, you know, it can't just be a bunch of children. There should be adults there should be people who have knowledge and skills that can be carried over into the valley, into the world that comes after. You know, like, you need a lot of adults, not just largely a caravan of children with some protectors. You know, I thought that idea was silly. I don't know if I actually articulated that when I was doing the overall review. But basically, you know, they're in retreat, and, you know, like, the demon army is trying to circumvent the defense line, and they can, but it takes time. It's more complicated. The crossings are more difficult. You know, blocked roads, blocked paths, dangerous creatures, all this stuff that stops the demon army from mounting an effective pursuit. And meanwhile, they're trying to break through at the dam, but they're contesting the dam so hard that basically it's like for like 2 or 3 weeks, Findogast gets held up there. I don't even say Findogast actually, because I forgot the part where it's like, but we also want the part where Findogast actually gets defeated, right? Because he was the only, you know, he's the only demon from the Word and the Void who never actually gets outright, you know, defeated by Nest Freemark and John Ross, right? So, you know, like we get to have that big final battle that I complained about when I was reviewing the Gypsy Morph, the book. And, you know, basically Findogast gets defeated because he's arrogant, he's overconfident, and he lets him, you know, and basically puts himself in a position where he gets destroyed. And I think that's very doable. Obviously require quite a bit of rewriting, especially of this final leg of the story, but I think it can be done. But then finally, what ends up happening is that finally the defense line at the dam is destroyed. It's completely overrun. They run out of ammunition. Their weapons are all broken and everything. And even though they've, you know, done everything they can to improvise traps and, you know, to stop them, you know, and the casualties are too high. And, you know, over time, also, Michael, being compassionate, has been sending people back. He's been sending small caravans of wounded and, you know, and people who have something to live for, you know, back to Hawk to go to the valley. And this eventually dwindles his force to the point where they're, you know, basically his force is overrun. And he's captured. And here's the thing. I mentioned in my previous reviews how I think the idea that, you know, basically the world gets nuked by a madman is a very, I'm not sure if it's a bad idea, but it feels very cheap. It feels like not the greatest way to end and reset the world. So what happens if Michael is captured? Because, you know, in my story, Michael's been a thorn in the side of the demons for decades, right? He's been a thorn in the side for decades. I'm swinging this screwdriver around for some reason. Don't ask me why. This is the screwdriver actually that came with the desk I'm using now. So I've just had it on my desk because it's not part of my regular toolbox, and now it's just something I'm pointing and sweeping around. But basically, what if Michael gets captured and gets brought before the greater cabal of demons? Because obviously it's not just Findogast and, you know, and his subordinates, but there's a whole bunch of other big shot demons, the ones leading the other armies across the world, and they've all gathered together in the United States, where their final victory has basically been achieved, and they're not really scared of anyone trying to thwart their plans, learning about their plans, trying to thwart their plans, or anything. And because the demons, you know, now that the Knights of the Word are largely beaten and in full retreat, and they don't have to worry about being interfered with, they're going to try and do something. They're going to try to do something magical to transform the world into something that they, some sort of great overarching goal, you know, in the service of the void. And it is then revealed, this is pretty important because I think it helps to tie everything together in a much neater fashion, rather than having the Genesis and the Word and the Void being so removed from everything else. because that's a big part of the problem. This is a big part of the big problem I have realistically with Genesis and with the prequels, is that they're very badly removed from the Shannara series as a whole, where most of their elements just do not get mentioned ever again. And basically what happens is the demons, to gloat over Michael, basically bring him to the, to wherever, this ritual site is. And in the middle of the ritual site is the Ildach. Because they have found this dark magical artifact, the Ildach, from the Wish Song of Shannara, which only ever gets mentioned once, even though it is apparently tied to at least some of the evil that we have seen prior in the Shannara series. And they're going to perform some sort of ritual based around the Ildach. But in the end, they were deceived. Because whatever it is, whatever this ritual is, I don't know what it is. I'm not going to think it through that clearly or that deeply. But whatever this ritual is, it's actually a deception. It's actually deceit. It's actually a trap. And what it is basically some sort of spell or some sort of magic that wipes out like 90% of all life on the of all remaining life on the planet. And basically it's like and when I say all life, I mean like animals, people, mutants, whatever it is. Maybe not the fish. I don't know. Maybe the fish are fine, but they were deceived, and it's like basically they were tricked into performing a magical rite that is only going to cause destruction. It's not going to it's not going to reshape the world. It's going to cause destruction, because it seems like the sort of thing that I feel like the Void ultimately would kind of go in for, and that is the world-ending calamity that that ends up resetting the world to become the land of Shannara. I know, the land of Shannara as we understand it, I guess is the best way to put that. And that's basically the retelling. That's basically in a very somewhat convoluted, somewhat jittery style. That's the story I would tell. A story that I feel like ultimately it makes a little more sense. It's not, it doesn't become obsessed with the idea of creating a hopeless world to the point where the world doesn't make sense. But it also ties the series together a little better. It also creates some more, even though we already have a big ensemble cast, it creates a couple more interesting characters that we can latch on to as well. But it also creates more perspective. It gives us a greater idea of what's going on in the world. I think that's all just, I think it's a healthier idea. Obviously, it needs to be edited, pared down. It needs to be rejiggered around. And also, I think that all three of the Genesis of Shannara novels would need to be longer, which I think is a good thing anyway. I think there was a big issue where, especially the Gypsy Moor, the final book, was just too short. It didn't have, it actually is, about, what is this, 450 pages? It's about 460 pages actually, in total in this small softcover, but it really needed to be like 550 pages to really flesh out all the things it was trying to do better. And some of this stuff I think just needed to be moved earlier into the trilogy, so that the other books would have to be a little longer as well. But I think that would have made for an overall healthier narrative. Now I could be wrong. And what anyone thinks of it, anyone who's already read Genesis, you can absolutely let me know if you think some of my ideas are good, some of them are bad. I don't think they're terrible, and anyone who says they're like absolutely terrible, I'm probably just going to dismiss out of hand. But at the same time, I'm kind of like, it's like I'm interested here, because having gone through it now, I just feel like there needed to be more to the story, and the story needed a little more, and needed more time in the oven. Because I almost think that's also part of the problem, is that Terry Brooks didn't spend long enough thinking about the narrative he was creating. And that created a lot of weaknesses in the narrative overall. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said in the previous video I recorded 3 weeks ago, I am reading a couple of other books right now. So I'm not going to be reviewing Legends soon-ish, though I do have the books now. I did buy Legends and Dark Legacy and they are currently sitting on the floor over there. Actually, I need to pick them up. But I did get Legends and Dark Legacy, so I'll be able to start those. So anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Until next time, everybody.